Firstly, welcome to everyone to the BioSS annual meeting 2021. For those that don't know me, I'm Glenn Marion. I'm head of research at BioSS. So I just sort of start off with a bit of housekeeping. So firstly, just a reminder that today's meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, because we can't edit it post hoc, could you just turn off your camera if you don't want to appear? But if you do, then that's great, and we'd like to see you. Secondly, if you could post comments in the chat during the talk, and we'll whoever's chairing, so me and Ken in that case, will try and ensure that the questions get relayed to the speakers. And then later on in the discussion, it's possible we might ask you to unmute and just ask your question directly. If you're using social media, could you use the hashtag BioSSGM 2021? Tess, could you put that in the chat, do you think? Thanks. And then finally, we've got a number of gaps in the program, so hopefully that gives everyone enough time to have a bit of breaks from their screen during the program. So, as you all know, the theme of this year of our meeting is statistical ecology, at least. And if you don't know that, you probably joined the wrong meeting. And I would say that the context for this area of research could hardly be more important or urgent, with pressures on ecosystems from human activity are intense and accelerating at the moment, and global efforts to try and mitigate those pressures are so far insufficient. As we saw at COP26, we weren't able to agree targets that will actually avoid dangerous climate change according to the most up-to-date science. But on top of that, on top of climate change, direct threats to biodiversity are also very critical and must be tackled, and in fact are linked to the climate crisis. So as many people have said, we might be in the midst of a sixth mass extinction that's likely more rapid than any previously seen in Earth's history. And ecosystems and the life support services they provide are under intense pressure, as seen by the wildfires that we've all witnessed this year on our TV screens, if not directly. And even more worrying, perhaps, in terms of climate change, several ecosystems now seem to be tipping from net sinks to net sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, in the boreal forest and tundra, and by some accounts, even in the Amazon. So in this context, the next decade is critical, and statistical ecology has surely got an important role to play in both quantifying these impacts, but also in trying to help develop policies and guide policies that will help us overcome these, what are really existential challenges. So I hope this meeting is very timely, and I hope through it we're able to develop some new collaborations and new project ideas. And this goal of our meetings is very much in line with Rob Kempton's, our founding director, Rob Kempton's goal for BIOS, which was to bring together mathematical and statistical and computational methodology and expertise to tackle real world challenges. And I think this area really exemplifies that. And so I'm therefore absolutely delighted that Ruth King has agreed to present the Rob Kempton Lecture this year, given her all the excellent work and how she has driven the field of statistical ecology in the last years. So that's at 4, and before that we've got 3 excellent talks from BIOS colleagues who are going to be talking about contrasting areas of statistical ecology, which have been research which has been conducted in collaboration with a wide range of collaborators and research organizations. So Adam Butler will be talking about how to quantify impacts of offshore renewables. Claire Harris will be describing some ongoing work as part of a landscape decision program project to develop modeling framework for vegetation dynamics. And Ken will give us his perspectives on the field of state-based modeling in statistical ecology. So one thing that I'm absolutely certain about is that you didn't log on to hear me talk. So I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to Adam. Could you share your screen, Adam?
Thank you, Glenn.
And yeah, during the talks, please do remember to post your questions if you have any, or comments for that matter. Okay, thanks, Adam. Take it away.
See my screen okay? Is that sharing okay?
Yeah, that looks great.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn. So I'll be talking today about quantifying ecological impacts of offshore renewables, some of the statistical challenges and opportunities. And I'm presenting here on behalf of the offshore renewables group within BioSS, which has got a lot bigger in the last few months. So I'll be trying to introduce what some of my colleagues, particularly people like Catherine and Anastasia that joined recently, will be working on. All of the work I'll talk about here is joint work with Kate Searle and Francis Daunt at UKCH and many, many other collaborators and stakeholders. I'll touch on a few here, but unfortunately, probably there'll be people that I'll miss. The funders, this is also funded by a range of different funders. A lot of the work I'll talk about here is funded by Marine Scotland under their ScotMer programme and by the ORGIP, which is an industry-funded partnership. But there's a range of other funders too. So the context of all of this work is that offshore renewable energy production is increasing very rapidly. I think I last talked about this about 3 years ago, and in that period there's been an enormous expansion in the industry, and it's still accelerating. The map you can see on the right-hand side here is actually now about 2 years out of date, but it shows constructed and sort of in construction wind farms and then plans for further ones. And the key thing you can see is there's already quite a lot of wind farms going in, but the plans for sort of future expansion are far, far larger than anything that's currently in place. And the motivation for this is primarily the need to try and meet greenhouse gas emissions targets. So the sort of ability to meet Scottish and UK targets is predicated quite heavily on being able to expand offshore wind a lot. But Scotland and the UK also have globally important and legally protected populations for a range of different species. I'm going to focus here on seabirds and marine mammals, and actually I'll mostly focus on seabirds, although Catherine and Esther have also worked on marine mammals. And many of the ideas carry over to those too. And the idea is offshore renewables can potentially have adverse ecological impacts on these species, and in decision making, something needs to be done about that. So the process is that developers need to demonstrate their developments are not going to have an adverse impact on protected populations. Statutory nature conservation bodies are then going to assess whether or not they demonstrated this and advise government, who will then reach a decision about whether or not to consent these wind farms. So it's a bit like the planning process for building things on land, but it's a complex process that goes over many years. These are very large developments, and these are big decisions with wide-reaching consequences, both economic consequences, but also consequences for biodiversity and for climate change mitigation. And so they can also face legal challenge because there's legislation underpinning all of this. So in the last few years, 4 of the big wind farm projects proposed for the east coast of Scotland ended up in a major court case, which ran on for a long period of time. And so on the back of that, and because in general it's important to make the right decisions in this area, there's a recognition from all the main stakeholders that you need to quantify impacts in a transparent and defensible way. So that's what motivates all of our work in this area. When we're talking about impacts, I'll be talking about both direct and indirect impacts. So when we think about the impacts of offshore wind farms, typically we think about direct impacts. So this is birds, marine mammals colliding with a wind turbine or some other structure associated with the wind farm. And for some species, direct impacts are the most important thing. For other species, indirect impacts can be equally or sometimes more important. When we're talking about seabirds, what we mean by indirect impacts is primarily 2 things. So looking at this diagram on the right, the idea is that in the breeding season in particular, seabirds are very constrained. So they live at their breeding colony, they commute out to different foraging locations, and then they come back to the breeding colony again to attend the nest. And so they're under some very tight constraints. So a wind farm might impact on this behavior in a few different ways. One of them is through barrier effects. So if the bird wanted to forage in this simple example at locations 1 or 3, a straight line route from the breeding colony would take it through the wind farm. And birds may choose to avoid traveling through wind farms. There's some evidence that they do. And in that case, that might need to take a longer route to reach those locations. A longer route means longer flying time, less time to return the chick at the nest, more use of energy in the commuting flight to get the same amount of food. An alternative mechanism is displacement. So if a bird had originally planned to forage at location 2A, but that's within the wind farm and the bird is displaced, it might decide to forage instead at 2B. Now, that might mean it encounters different prey, it might mean it encounters lower quality of prey or can intake prey at a lower rate. And it could also mean, if other birds are being displaced, that it encounters higher competition. And again, that then impacts on the energetics of that bird. And the idea is that these kind of impacts accrued over the course of the breeding season can mean that birds gain mass less quickly than they would otherwise, and that their chicks may or may be less likely to survive. And that then drives changes in productivity and survival of the species. And so quantitative tools are used to model all of these different elements of these effects. Quantitative tools come in at 2 points. The first point is in trying to assess before a development's built what is likely to happen as a precursor to deciding whether it will be consented or not, and if it is consented, whether any conditions to try and reduce the impacts will be imposed. And the other way tools come in is in terms of monitoring impacts post-construction. I'm going to focus in this talk mostly on the first of these, in part because that's mostly what we've worked on so far, but also because at the current point we're at, most developments are not yet built. So the focus at the moment is primarily on assessing impacts before developments are being built. And this diagram just shows the set of tools that are currently used in Scotland for looking at seabirds. So you can see that there's a range of different data that comes in. There's then a range of different tools, some of which focus on specific mechanisms, collision risk, displacement risk, and others are more generic. So apportioning, which is looking at the proportion of birds that originate from particular colonies, and population viability analysis, which is about translating the impacts into sort of longer term consequences. So the idea is each of these is built on a model, and so models are being used extensively in these assessments. But these current tools are rather inconsistent in the way they quantify uncertainty and limited in their ability to make use of all of the available data sources that we have available to us. So that's a strong rationale for developing more advanced quantitative methods. And the argument is that if we can develop more advanced methods, we can reduce consent risk, which is sort of highlighted by government and industry as the key objective here, is to reduce the chance that a development will go forward quite a long way towards consent and then ultimately fall down. This is bad for everyone. So the idea is you can reduce consent risk if you can quantify uncertainty in a more defensible way, which avoids the need for more ad hoc approaches within decision making. And if you can use tools to reduce uncertainty through using existing data in better ways. So I'll come on to things like data integration that I'll talk about. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is to give an overview of some of the ways that statistical research can potentially address some of these questions and give us some examples from our own work of ways we've been trying to address some of these questions ourselves. A lot of what I'll talk about here comes from a report that we were involved in earlier this year, funded by JNCC, on potential ways of improving the representation of uncertainty in assessing impacts on ornithology. These are the main methodological areas that I'm going to touch on in the talk. As you can see, most of these are the kinds of topics that are generally encountered in statistical ecology. So in some ways, this, I guess, provides quite a nice basis for the talks that follow, which will all relate to many of these topics. In other ways, though, offshore renewables poses some specific problems about how these techniques can be applied and used, partly because of the quite complicated nature of the data sets involved. And then the final bit that I'll talk about here is the translation of these methods into practical tools and guidance to support policy, which is quite specific to the offshore renewables context. The first topic is one that BioSS has a lot of experience in, and is obviously a general area of much research in statistical ecology, which is around spatial modeling. And the reason this is really important here is that a key determinant of risk to whether a wind farm will impact seabirds or any other taxa or not is the extent to which individuals from the protected population actually use the wind farm footprint, even before the wind farm is being built. If they don't, there isn't likely to be much risk. At-sea surveys, typically based on things like aerial transect surveys, are the sort of mainstay of how these things are estimated and mapped. prior to a wind farm being built. And they're very useful, these kind of surveys. They give us a lot of information on abundance and relative spatial abundance. But something that they can't tell us is which colonies individuals have come from. And this is very important because that's the level at which the legal protection is applied. And it's also the level at which the ecological processes operate. So we need other data, GPS tracking data, geolocator data, to try and map things back to specific colonies. All of these kinds of data can also, after construction, be used to tell us something about the likely impact of the wind farm on the spatial distribution of birds, in particular to try and estimate the extent to which avoidance and displacement caused by the wind farm is actually occurring in practice. So the challenges and opportunities here are really around trying to model these different kinds of spatial data. There's been quite a lot of work already on spatial modeling of at-sea survey data, particularly University of St Andrews at Cream. They've developed some very nice software based on spatially adaptive regression spines called the MRC software, which is now the standard way that this is done in practice in offshore renewables. But there's still more work to do in that area, particularly around trying to deal more with things like interannual variability and things that sort of go beyond the level at which the surveys are actually collected. A sort of more obvious area where a lot more work is needed is in spatial modeling of GPS tracking data. Because the GPS tracking data are colony specific, models of this rapidly can become quite complicated, and the data sets and sort of sets of predicted values and so on can become enormous. There was a paper a few years ago by Ewan Wakefield that was a first attempt to produce predictive national scale maps of spatial distributions from GPS tracking data. We're currently involved in a project to try and apply the same methods to lesser blackback gulls. But more generally, there's interest in trying to improve these spatial models in order to better capture uncertainty, because that was one of the key limitations of the Wakefield approach, that it couldn't really capture the uncertainty in predicting out to colonies where you don't have any data. Another challenge is around trying to bring in alternative sources of spatial data. So one of them that we're interested in is geolocators. And I'll give a bit more information about a current project that we're working on, which is called the ORGIP APSAS project, funded by ORGIP. And a key objective of this project is to try and look at how we apportion seabirds in the non-breeding season. So in general, there's been a lot of work on the breeding season, but the non-breeding season is quite a lot harder to study, in part because GPS tracking data are not easy to collect all the year round. For these seasons, then, we can use a different source of data called geolocators. These collect data on light levels, which are then translated sort of post hoc into estimates of sunset and sunrise, and hence location. This is a very neat idea, and they collect data on things that would otherwise be very hard to study, but there's a lot of uncertainty in these estimates of location, much more than in GPS tracking data, and the level of precision is also variable depending on things like time of the year. And so the BIOS component of this work, which Dave is working on and is just getting started, is to do with trying to model the uncertainty in geolocator locations and to propagate that through into our estimates of proportion of birds coming from each of the different populations. Spatial modeling is one key area, but really this is tied in with another area, which is modeling movement and behavior. And that's because the risk of collision or displacement doesn't only depend on whether the birds are using the space around the wind farm to begin with, but also on what their movement and behavior tends to be in that area. So for example, collision risk really only occurs at certain flight heights. Birds have to be at a height where they're going to, or liable to interact with the blades for collision risk to come into play. And displacement risk really primarily relates to foraging behavior rather than other behaviors. And therefore, having some way of estimating behavior from empirical data, such as tracking data, is really important. Hidden Markov models are widely used in applied ecology and are clearly one major tool for trying to do this, but seabird tracking data have some quite complicating characteristics that are not always easy to capture using simple HMMs. So some of the challenges and opportunities here are around modeling variability between individuals, seasons, years, colonies. These are quite complex hierarchical data sets, and so building in these levels of variability is important. Another key challenge is around missing data, which do occur quite often in GPS tracking data for seabirds. but also increasingly there's issues around sort of deliberately missing data, so where variable frequencies are used, because there might be very good reasons to want to collect higher frequency data, for example, within a wind farm than in the surrounding area, and when they're at sea to use a higher frequency than when they're at the colony. So we need to have then ways of dealing with these variable frequencies in our modelling of behaviour. Another key challenge is developing models that can actually inform decisions regarding data collection around things like, should we use these variable frequencies? If we do, what are the implications for our ability to classify behaviour? And can we then use these kind of models to look at power? So how many individuals need to be tagged and for how long and so forth. And I think that the final challenge here, which is seems to me the most ambitious and the one that I'm least clear on how we'll solve, is trying to bring together these models of behavior with models of spatial distribution and space use, because the questions they're answering are overlapping, and ultimately it would be good to integrate these two kinds of models more closely. Just a few bits of current work that we're involved in relating to this. We've done various projects applying hidden Markov models to GPS tracking data, and one of the current ones we're involved in, it uses variable frequency GPS data, so we're getting to grips with that. We're also involved in co-supervising 2 PhD students who recently started. One of these is Rebecca Akarasola, who I think might be on the call today, who's joined between University of Edinburgh and BIOS, and whose work is on hidden Markov models and extensions of them, and particularly working with data on turns. Turn data are nice because you actually have manual records of behavior for some of the turn tracks, and that can be used as a form of validation. So that's some of the work she's been doing that we're involved in. Another student who's just started is Eloise Bray, who's joined between Sheffield, BIOS and UKCH, and she's interested in using continuous time models to look at seabird movement and behavior, and particularly on her initial question is around how you simulate realistic foraging trips using these kind of data. So both of those things, spatial distributions and movement/behavior, involve quite a lot of different data sets. And one of the key characteristics is that many of the key questions, there's only so far we can go with a single kind of data. And even where we can just use a single kind of data, often one of the main ways we can achieve this objective of reducing uncertainty is by integrating multiple data sets. And if we're going to do that, and we want a defensible estimation of uncertainty, we need to do this within some sort of coherent framework, and that motivates the need for data integration methods. The challenges and opportunities here depend on the kinds of data that are being combined. I'm not going to say too much on this. Jason Mathiopoulos, who I think was also on the call today, has been doing lots of work in this area. In particular, there's a Marine Scotland project on combining different forms of spatial survey data derived from different platforms. RSPB, with involvement from others, have also been involved in using different forms of sensor data to look at behavior and movement. So, for example, to bring in data from accelerometers or TDR tags to use in addition to GPS tracking data. And the final area, which I think is in some ways probably the most challenging, and it is one that we've been quite interested in, is in whether you can combine GPS tracking data and at-sea survey data to learn about spatial distributions. These are two distinct sources of data on the same thing, but they have different structures and make different assumptions. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to use them together to learn about spatial distributions. I think when I last spoke about this, I talked about an initial project we were involved in to look at that. That project's now finished. And it made some progress in trying to look at how you might model the two things together, but there's still a lot to do on modeling those. And we didn't manage to properly quantify uncertainty when we did it there. So proper data integration methods are needed there. I think this is something Jason Mathiopoulos is also working on. The next area I'm going to talk about is slightly different, and I guess slightly less something that's often encountered in statistical ecology. And this is to do with emulation and related methods for statistical analysis of process-based models. This is an area that Ken's been very involved in, and Anastasia is beginning to work on too. The idea is that these process-based models are a key part of this assessment process. So assessing risk beforehand involves using predictive mechanistic models. The band model and extensions of it are used to look at collision risk. This is a simple physics-based model. For displacement, UKCH and us developed a process-based model called Seaboard that can be used to look at these more indirect effects. So process-based models are playing a key part in looking at likely impacts of future developments. But there's lots of challenges and opportunities here. Some of them are obvious sorts of things for statisticians to contribute to around calibration of model parameters and validation of the models against post-construction data. But there's also, these are all stochastic models, and there's also interest in whether we can improve the formulation of the stochastic elements of them, building in more realistic sources of variability into the models, and unifying the different models together. For example, for collision and displacement, we were involved in an initial process to start to try and do that, but there's a lot more work to properly unify these in a way that makes sense in a stochastic setting. Another key challenge is around how we link these kind of process-based models to the sort of fairly detailed statistical models of movement and space use I talked about before, and in particular how we link them back to data on prey, which is currently the biggest limitation of the displacement models. And there should be a project starting in the new year funded by OEC to look at prey distributions and predator-prey interactions and how that can be translated into the kind of things that the Seaboard model uses. So Seaboard's an individual-based model, and two of the current limitations of it are that it's very computer-intensive and it relies on a lot of data that's not always available. A project that began recently involves construction of a statistical emulator to try and approximate Seaboard using only things that are widely available and so could be sort of derived anywhere, with the objective of understanding how mortality rates simulated by Seaboard vary in relation to colony wind farm characteristics, and to develop tools to rapidly quantify displacement risk using this kind of simplification of the process-based model. And this ties into wider work BioSS is involved in on process-based models and emulation led by Ken. The final sort of technical area I'll touch on is population models. Mechanistic models are typically used to get annual mortality, and these then need to be translated into longer term consequences through things called population viability analyses, which are typically based on matrix population models, both run with impacts under a wind farm and under baseline conditions and comparing the two. And there's challenges and opportunities here around incorporating different kinds of processes, density dependence, metapopulation models, non-breeding birds, and other drivers such as climate change into these models, but crucially in how we estimate all of these things from empirical data and how we bring in things like novel data sources. So there should be hopefully a project on using MOTIS data starting at some point next year and how that can be used to derive demographic rates. And then, as I said, the final element of this is, can we translate these things into practice? So all of these potential benefits of using more advanced statistical methods can only be realized if we can translate them into policy and decision making. And the policy landscape in this area is developing extremely rapidly because it's such a fast growing area. So it's crucial for us to be involved with stakeholders from the outset, identifying where statistical needs might arise and looking at what statistical research is needed. Some of the key areas that are sort of growing in terms of where statistical modeling might be useful are around how we assess in combination of impacts of multiple wind farms and how we combine impacts of wind farms with cumulative effects of other drivers such as climate change. And also how we look at things such as mitigation and compensation measures that are used to try and reduce the impact of offshore renewables where they are being built. Can we evaluate how effective they are, for example, through best practice guidance on monitoring? So to conclude, this is a rapidly growing area of high societal importance, particularly in relation to climate change. It poses some very big scientific challenges, and those in turn present lots of challenges for developing new quantitative methods. So I think the stats community has a key role to play in addressing these problems, and I've tried to provide some examples of that, largely from our own work within BIOS, but we're not the only group working in this area by any means. It's a very exciting area to be in, but I think to do it successfully, we have to work very closely with not just scientists, but also with stakeholders, and to be very clear in articulating why developing new statistical methods is important in ways that these stakeholders can appreciate. Thank you very much for your time.
I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I had one question for you, Adam, and that is, is there much discussion of the establishment of control sites where you know no wind farms are going to go in, so that you can do sort of before after control impact kind of analyses?
Yeah, it's I mean, certainly from my experience, it's come up quite a few times in discussion around different things, and yes, I think probably the problem will be increasingly that there will be a lack of sites where you can put control sites as things develop. I mean, one of the issues, I guess, is finding control sites that are sufficiently comparable to use. So on the east coast of the UK, for example, you'd probably want to try and use control sites on the east coast of the UK, and it will become increasingly hard, I think, as the industry develops to find suitable control sites. So yes, it's definitely something that I mean, I think it's been used to some extent, but I think it will become increasingly difficult, because I guess the characteristics that make sites good for offshore renewables mean finding a good control site. It's likely to also be a site that's being considered for wind farms, but it's definitely a good point, and it is something that is used to some extent, yeah, as I understand it.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was muted there. I couldn't unmute myself. So someone rescued me, but I don't know who it was. If people have questions, you could raise your hand and I'll call on you, or in fact, just unmute yourself and ask a question. One question I had was for people who aren't in this area. I was wondering how easy it is to access the sort of data that you would need to start doing this kind of study.
So some of the data is fairly easily accessible. Other data, quite a lot of the at-sea survey data I talked about is commercially collected, so not all of that's easily accessible. Things like the GPS tracking data, RSPB have collected an enormous amount of that, and that is sort of accessible fairly easily through applying to them. So I think it's mixed. Some of the data is and some isn't. I think there's sort of moves to try and make even industry collected data a bit more accessible, but at the moment I think it's a bit mixed.
Okay, thanks. Oh, Colin has a question. Do you want to ask it, Colin?
Yeah, it was just in the context of regulators and legal requirements. I wasn't sure whether there was anything in terms of dictates about how much effort had to be put into certain aspects of things like at-sea surveys, and is it specified? I'm just thinking in terms of like the pharmaceutical industry can be quite constrained about things that have to be done in a certain way. And is that becoming more the case here? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, so I think it is. I mean, particularly in terms of things like the number of years of data post-construction they have to collect once a wind farm's being built. That's very, my understanding is that's kind of tied to the conditions of the consent they're given. So as part of that consent, they have to collect this post-consent monitoring data. Some of the other kinds of, I think what's happening though is my understanding is that developers are often also, particularly before wind farms are built, then going beyond what they have to do, partly because it's often in their interests if they can collect additional data that reduces uncertainty, if that sort of reduces the chance of the thing falling through at a late stage. So some of it's driven by what they have to do from a regulatory point of view, but some of it's driven by the fact that it's often in their interests to collect other data. And then a lot of the more science work, they just think it's sort of in their interest as an industry to understand these things better. So sort of yes and no, I think, to your original question.
And there's a question from Catherine. I'll just ask it in the interest of time. But what data sources are available to deal with the migratory prey distributions? He's asking.
So I mean, prey distributions is probably one of the main limitations at the moment in the whole area, I think. So a lot of the projects we've been involved in so far haven't really had prey data, so it's used environmental proxies of prey. We've had some projects we've been able to use fishing data, but that's also been quite limited what we can get access to. There is this project starting next year, which will be collecting actual empirical data on prey that we're involved in. So that's quite exciting. That's in the Forth Tay and the Moray Firth. But that's sort of the first project where we've actually been involved with people collecting sort of real prey data. I mean, that's really just in the Scottish waters, so I don't think it's looking beyond that, but a sort of first attempt at using real prey data anyway.
And that presumably opens up the types of models you can apply to be
Yeah.
more mechanistic.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it's partly developing the sort of statistical model is to be closer to the mechanistic models, I guess, because they're more focused on the actual processes. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could all join me in thanking Adam.